The final turn of the wagon wheel was a sound of ending. It grated in the alkali dust, a long, sighing complaint of wood and iron that had carried Caroline Wolfe 1,000 miles from a life she no longer owned. The sound stopped, and in the sudden silence, the heat and the light of the Wyoming Territory pressed in. It was a physical weight, a blacksmith's blanket thrown over the world. From her seat, Caroline looked out on Fort Laramie. It was less a fortress than a scar, a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled together against the vast, indifferent prairie. A flag hung limp on its pole, the colors washed out by the relentless sun. The air tasted of grit and smelled of horse, sweat, and the distant promise of pine from the hills. Soldiers drilled in the dusty parade ground, their blue uniforms filmed with a layer of pale dirt, their shouted commands snatched away by the wind. Traders with faces like cracked leather argued over barrels of flour and bolts of cloth. It was a place of harsh noises and sharp edges, a seam stitched clumsily between the world she knew and the one she was about to enter. And there, just beyond the orbit of the fort's nervous energy, they stood, Lakota men, watching. They were still as the ancient stones of the land, their presence a quiet rebuke to the fort's frantic bustle. They did not shout or haggle. They simply were, their dark eyes taking in everything, their braided hair gleaming under the sun. They were the other side of the seam, the thread that held the wildness together. Caroline pressed her hands together in her lap, the worn fabric of her gray dress a poor shield against the eyes she could feel upon her. The gazes of the soldiers and traders were the worst. They slid over her, greasy with pity and a certain kind of contempt. A widow, young, too. Bad luck clung to a woman like that. A faint, foul scent. Only men of a certain sort seemed to smell. They saw a problem to be solved, or a creature to be pitied, or a piece of unclaimed property. They did not see a woman who had buried her own husband because no one else would touch a man taken by the fever. They did not see the calluses on her hands from scrubbing other people's floors in Philadelphia to keep a roof over her head while Arthur wasted away. Arthur, his memory was like a ghost limb, an ache where something used to be. He had been a man full of dreams, all of them built on borrowed money and flimsy hope. When the fever took him, it took the dreams, too, leaving behind only the cold, hard fact of his debts that his brother, Edward, had been all too eager to assume. Edward, with his soft hands and his voice that sounded like coins rubbing together. He had presented it as an act of charity, a way to keep her from the poorhouse. He would settle Arthur's accounts. All she had to do was become his wife. It was not a proposal. It was a foreclosure. He would have her, and the last of her dignity, as payment for his brother's failed ambitions. The law, he had reminded her, was on his side. A widow had few rights and fewer options. But Caroline had found another option, a strange, terrifying, and yet liberating one. A letter from a missionary, passed through the Church Aid Society, spoke of a Lakota leader, a man of standing among his people, a man named Thasi Kamna, Iron Shell. He had lost his own wife to the coughing sickness that winter. He was not looking for a wife in the way men like Edward understood the term. He needed a partner, someone who could read the white man's treaties, someone who could understand the forked tongue of their paper promises. He offered passage, protection, and a place within his household, not as a servant, but as a spouse. It was a contract, a bargain struck between two desperate worlds. She had chosen the unknown over the known degradation. She had chosen the wilderness over the civilized cage Edward had prepared for her. It was a choice that had brought her here, to this dusty outpost where shame and hope fought a bitter war inside her heart. A man detached himself from the shade of the sutler's store and walked toward the wagon. He was not a soldier. He wore buckskin trousers and a linen shirt, and his skin was tanned the color of seasoned oak. His hair was long, but not braided like the Lakota men's. He moved with an easy stride that seemed to mock the stiff, formal marching of the soldiers. The wagon driver, a taciturn man named Silas who had not spoken more than a dozen words to her since Omaha. Grunted, "That'll be Renville. He's your man." Joseph Renville stopped beside the wagon and looked up at her. His eyes were clear and direct, neither pitying nor predatory. They were simply observant. "Mrs. Wolf?" he asked. His voice was calm, a quiet current in the noisy air. "Yes," Caroline said, her own voice sounding thin and reedy. "I am Caroline Wolf." "I am Joseph Renville. I am to guide you." He did not offer to help her down, a small omission she found strangely respectful. He assumed she was capable. She gathered her skirts, mindful of the watching eyes, and descended from the wagon, her boots sinking into the soft, warm dust. The ground felt unsteady after so many weeks of rocking and swaying. She stood before him, a small, solitary figure in gray. She had expected to be taken into the fort, to be given a room, to have a moment to wash the trail from her skin and her soul. She had imagined a formal meeting, a moment to compose herself before being presented to the man whose name she had agreed to carry. Renville gave a slight nod to Silas, who began unhitching the weary horses without a backward glance. Her trunk and single carpet bag were set down in the dust, a pathetic little island of her former life. The wagon, her last link to Philadelphia, was already turning, its wheels creaking a final goodbye. "We should go," Renville said. "It is a walk of a mile or so. The camp is by the river." Caroline blinked. "We are not going into the fort." A faint smile touched the corners of his mouth. "The agreement was not made with the fort, Mrs. Wolf. It was made with the people of Thasi Kamna." He gestured, not toward the imposing gates of Fort Laramie, but away, following the curve of the North Platte River where cottonwoods shimmered green against the dusty brown of the plains. A jolt went through her, cold and sharp despite the heat. This was the first test. The rules were different here. The safety she had imagined, the brief respite within the white man's walls, was an illusion. The game, as she had thought of it, was not to be played on her terms, or on any terms she recognized. It would be played by Lakota rules, on Lakota land, from the very first step. The path Renville took was not a road, but a tracery of countless footsteps along the riverbank. The sounds of the fort faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of wind through dry grass and the lazy buzz of insects. The sun beat down on her bonnet, and she could feel sweat trickling between her shoulder blades. This, she thought, was the real boundary. Not the walls of the fort, but this invisible line where the noise of one world gave way to the deep, resonant silence of another. This was where the map of her old life had ended. She thought of Edward's face, contorted with disbelief and then rage when she had informed him of her decision. He had called her a fool, and worse, he had threatened to have her declared mentally unfit, but she had already sold the few possessions of value she had left, bought her passage, and set her face to the west. She was running, yes, but for the first time in her life, she felt she was running toward something, not just away. She was running toward a chance to stand on her own feet, even if those feet were planted in unfamiliar and perhaps hostile soil. The dryness was relentless. It pulled at the moisture in her skin, her throat, her eyes. It was a constant, thirsty presence, a force that demanded surrender. She walked on, matching Renville's steady pace, her carpet bag growing heavier with each step. Her shame was a stone in her gut. She was a woman for sale, a piece of human currency in a transaction she barely understood. Yet, with every footstep that took her further from the judging eyes of the fort, another feeling began to blossom in the barren ground of her heart determination. She would not be a weeping, helpless burden. She would be what she had promised to be useful. She would hold up her end of the bargain. She would earn her keep, after what felt like an eternity. Renville stopped. He pointed ahead. There, the camp of the Oglala. Through a grove of cottonwoods, she saw them. The tippies rose from the earth like pale, graceful cones, their skins glowing in the late afternoon sun. Smoke curled from their peaks, thin blue ribbons against the vast, pale sky. The camp was alive with a quiet, purposeful energy. The sound of children's laughter, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood, the soft murmur of voices speaking a language that sounded like the river itself. It was a world entire, complete, and utterly alien. There was no wall around it, no gate. Yet she felt she was standing at the threshold of a place more fortified and more ancient than any army post. This was it, the end of the journey and the beginning of the trial. Her life would be decided here, in this circle of hide lodges by the river. If she could not adapt, if she could not find the strength to bend, she would break. The wind sighed through the cottonwood leaves, and for a moment, it sounded like a name being whispered, a name she did not yet know how to carry. As they walked into the camp, a stillness fell over the immediate area. Women who had been scraping hides looked up, their tools pausing mid-stroke. Children stopped their games, their dark, curious eyes following the strange woman in the gray dress. It was not a hostile silence, but one of profound, unwavering observation. Caroline felt like a page from a foreign book, suddenly inserted into a story where everyone else already knew the language. She kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, focusing on the back of Joseph Renville's linen shirt. To show fear would be to confirm every prejudice they held against her. Renville led her to one of the larger lodges, its hide covering painted with symbols she did not understand. A horse, a sun, a series of bold, black lines. He lifted the flap, and a wave of warm, smoky air washed over her. He spoke a few words in the flowing Lakota tongue and then stepped aside, holding the flap for her. Caroline took a deep breath and entered. The light inside was dim, filtered through the translucent hide and centered on a small, smokeless fire burning in a shallow pit. The ground was covered with buffalo robes, and the lodge's framework of poles was hung with parfleche cases, weapons, and bundles of dried herbs. A woman sat by the fire, her back to the entrance. She did not turn as Caroline entered. Renville spoke again, his voice soft. The woman rose slowly and turned to face them. This, Caroline knew, must be Waikela, the sister of Thasi Kamna. She was a woman who seemed carved from the land itself. Her face was a map of sun and wind, her eyes dark and intelligent, missing nothing. Her hands, resting at her sides, were not delicate. They were strong, capable, the hands of a woman who knew every kind of work. She wore a simple doeskin dress, decorated with a discipline that spoke of pride, not vanity. Her gaze met Caroline's, and in it, Caroline saw a challenge as clear as a drawn line in the dust. There was no welcome here, only assessment. Silence stretched, thick and heavy as a winter blanket. It was a language in itself, and Caroline understood she was being measured by her ability to endure it. She stood still, her hands loosely clasped in front of her, and met the older woman's gaze without flinching. She did not offer a nervous smile or a deferential dip of her head. She simply stood, a woman waiting. Finally, Waikela spoke a single, sharp word. Renville translated. She says, "Sit." Waikela gestured to a buffalo robe on the opposite side of the fire. Caroline moved with as much grace as she could muster and sat, tucking her worn boots beneath her skirts. Waikela sat opposite her. The fire pit between them was a small, contained world of its own, the flames dancing like silent storytellers. Waikela then began a long, low speech, her eyes never leaving Caroline's face. She did not seem to be speaking to Renville, but directly to Caroline, as if expecting her to understand through sheer force of will. When she finished, a deep quiet returned to the lodge. Renville cleared his throat. Waikela says that a white woman is like a summer frost, pretty on the surface, but she cannot survive the first hardship. She says you have the look of one who has known sorrow, but she does not know if it has made you strong or if it has just made you brittle. She asks why you have come here, to a people you do not know, to a life that will break you. Caroline took a moment to compose her thoughts. A torrent of justifications, of pleas for understanding, rose in her throat. But she swallowed them down. Pity was a currency she could not afford to trade in. Respect was the only thing of value here. "Tell her," Caroline said, her voice even and low, "that I have come because this was the only path that allowed me to keep my name. Where I come from, a woman in my position is seen as a debt to be passed from one man to another. I chose to be a partner rather than a property." Renville translated. Wisela listened, her expression unchanging. Then she rose and walked behind Caroline. Caroline tensed, but forced herself to remain still. She felt Wisela's strong fingers touch her hair, which was pinned in a tight, respectable bun at the nape of her neck. With a swift, efficient motion, Wisela pulled the pins free. Caroline's hair, fine and brown, tumbled down her back. It felt like an act of violation, a stripping away of her civilized armor. Wisela made a sound, a low grunt that could have meant anything. She produced a comb made of horn and began to pull it through Caroline's hair. The strokes were not gentle. They were firm, untangling the knots from the long journey with a methodical roughness. When her hair was smooth, Wisela parted it down the middle. Then, taking a thick lock on one side, she began to braid. It was a tight, three-strand plait, woven with a tension that pulled at Caroline's scalp. She worked quickly, her fingers sure and practiced. When she finished one side, she moved to the other, creating a matching braid. The two braids felt heavy against her shoulders, alien and severe. They changed the shape of her face, pulling the skin taut at her temples. It was a transformation, an unmaking and a remaking. When Wisela was done, she returned to her seat by the fire and looked at Caroline's new reflection in the flickering light. Next, Wisela pointed to the fire. "Fita," she said, her voice flat and clear. She pointed to a water skin leaning against the lodge poles. "Menni." She picked up a wooden bowl. "Waxika." She was not asking. She was commanding, "Learn." Caroline watched the woman's lips, listened to the shape of the sounds. She pointed to the fire. "Fita," she repeated, her tongue clumsy around the unfamiliar consonants. Wisela gave a barely perceptible nod. Caroline pointed to the water skin, "Menni," and then to the bowl, "Waxika." They continued this way for some time. Wisela would point to an object, name it, and wait, robe, knife, tipi, sky, earth. Caroline listened, repeated, and stored the sounds away. She was a reader, a woman of letters, and she treated this new language as a text to be memorized, one word at a time. She did not smile or express frustration. She was a student, focused and obedient. Finally, Wisela seemed satisfied. She reached into a rawhide bag and pulled out a small, dark, greasy-looking cake. She broke a piece off and held it out to Caroline. "Pemmican," Renville supplied softly. "Buffalo meat, dried and pounded, mixed with melted fat and berries. It is the food of the trail. It is the food of survival." It looked unappetizing, dense and unyielding. The smell was of tallow and dried blood, with a faint, sweet tang of berries. Caroline knew this was another test, a test of her stomach, of her willingness to accept what was offered, of her ability to adapt. She thought of the thin, watery soups of her last months in Philadelphia, of the gnawing hunger that had been a constant companion. This was not a delicacy. This was life. She took the piece of pemmican from Wisela's fingers. She brought it to her lips and took a small, deliberate bite. The texture was waxy and dense, the flavor intense and strange. It was salty, smoky, and faintly sweet all at once. It was food that demanded to be chewed, to be worked for. She chewed slowly, her face impassive, and swallowed. She did not grimace or shudder. She took another bite. When she had finished the piece, she looked at Wisela and met her gaze. The silence returned, but it had changed. It was less of a judgment now and more of a question. It was time for the final truth. "Mr. Renville," Caroline said, her voice quiet but firm, "please tell her everything. Do not soften it." And so, as Renville translated each sentence, Caroline laid her story bare in the firelight of the smoky lodge. She spoke of her husband, Arthur, and his sickness. She spoke of the debts he had left, a weight that had threatened to crush her. She spoke of his brother, Edward, and his proposal that was no proposal at all, but a demand for payment in the flesh. Then she spoke the hardest part. "When my husband died," she said, looking straight at Waisela, "we had no money for an undertaker. Our neighbors were afraid of the fever. No one would help me. So I took the shovel myself. I dug his grave in the churchyard, and I buried him with my own hands." She let the words hang in the air. This was the truth of her. Not a delicate widow from the East, but a woman who knew the weight of a shovel full of earth. A woman who had faced death and debt alone. When Renville finished translating, the lodge was utterly still. Waisela's dark eyes searched Caroline's face, looking for any hint of falsehood, any plea for sympathy. She found none. For a long time, Waisela did not move. She sat like a stone figure by the fire, her expression unreadable. Caroline's heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She had laid her only cards on the table. She had nothing left. Then, slowly, deliberately, Waisela gave a single, sharp nod. It was not a gesture of warmth or friendship. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a concession. The gatekeeper had seen the truth of the traveler, and had found it, if not pleasing, then at least sufficient. The gate, narrow and difficult, had just opened a crack. Waisela reached for a bowl of rich, dark stew simmering by the fire and pushed it across the robe toward Caroline. It was an invitation, an acceptance. "You may eat at my fire. You have earned this much." The next few days passed in a haze of labor and observation. Caroline was given a space in Waisela's lodge, a set of robes that were to be hers. Her life fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the household. She learned to scrape hides, her hands quickly blistering and then hardening into a new, tougher version of themselves. She learned the patient work of grinding corn with a stone, the motion becoming a form of meditation. She helped gather wood, her arms and back aching with a satisfying weariness at the end of each day. No one coddled her. She was given tasks, and she did them. Her presence was accepted as a fact, if not yet a welcome one. She had not yet seen the man whose life she was meant to join. Then, one afternoon, as the sun began its long slide toward the horizon, Joseph Renville appeared at the entrance to the lodge. "He will see you now," he said simply. Waisela, who was mending a moccasin, looked up at Caroline. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes held a flicker of something, a final, silent warning. "Do not fail this." Caroline washed her hands in the water bucket, dried them on her apron, and smoothed the twin braids that now felt as much a part of her as her own skin. She followed Renville out of the lodge and into the golden light. He led her away from the camp, back toward the river. The man was waiting for them there, standing beneath a tall cottonwood, its leaves shimmering like 1,000 tiny silver coins in the breeze. This was Thasi Kamna, Iron Shell. He was taller than she had expected, with a leader's breadth of shoulder and a stillness that seemed to draw the landscape in around him. He was not handsome in the way of Philadelphia gentlemen. His face was all angles and planes, a face shaped by wind and thought, his mouth firm, his eyes deep-set and serious. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest and arms bare, his skin the color of rich earth. He looked at her as she approached, and his gaze was like his sister's, direct, assessing, and utterly without artifice. It was the gaze of a man who had no time for anything but the truth. Caroline stopped a respectful distance away, with Renville standing between them, the bridge for their words. The river murmured beside them, a constant, soothing presence. Thasi Kamna spoke, his voice a low baritone, the words flowing in the liquid cadence of his own tongue. He spoke for some time, his eyes on Caroline. When he finished, Ranville turned to her. He says he has heard from his sister what you told her. He says she believes you are a woman who is not afraid of the truth, or of work. He says these are good things. Ranville listened again as Thassi spoke. He wishes to tell you of marriage, as his people see it. It is not a cage. It is not a chain one person puts on another. A man and a woman build a lodge together. They share its warmth. They work to keep it strong. If one day one of them chooses to leave, they may walk away. The lodge is broken, but the person is not. The marriage lasts only as long as both people choose to keep it each day. This struck Caroline with the force of a physical blow. The idea was so foreign, so radical. It sent a tremor through every notion of duty and permanence she had been raised with. Marriage as a daily choice, not a lifelong sentence. The freedom in it was as terrifying as it was liberating. Thassi spoke again, his tone becoming more practical. He says his first wife was a good woman, a strong woman. His heart was sad when she walked the Star Road, but his people need a leader who can think of the future. The white men come with their papers. The words on the paper are like traps for the unwary. The words they speak in council are often different from the words they write. He needs a partner who can see the traps. He needs someone whose eyes can walk the paper road and tell him of its dangers. He says this is the work he is offering. It is a great and heavy burden for his people. The weight of his proposal settled over her. He was not offering her a home out of pity. He was offering her a job of vital importance. He was asking her to be a weapon, a shield. He fell silent, waiting for her response. This was her moment to be as honest as he was, to pretend she had come for love, or for some romantic notion of life in the wild, would be an insult to the clear-eyed bargain he was laying before her. "Please tell him," she said to Ranville, her voice clear and steady, "that I understand, and I must be honest as well. I did not choose to come here because I yearned for this life. I knew nothing of it. I came because the world I knew offered me only shame. It offered me a life as the property of a man I did not respect. I chose to answer his offer because it was the only one that allowed me to keep my dignity. I chose to be a partner, not a possession. I will do the work he asks of me to the best of my ability, because my own honor depends on it." Ranville translated her words faithfully. As he spoke, Tassi's gaze never left her face. He seemed to be listening less to the translation and more to the spirit behind her words, the core of truth from which they came. When Ranville was finished, a long silence fell, broken only by the river and the leaves. Thassi looked at Ranville and said a single, soft word. Ranville nodded and, to Caroline's surprise, he took several steps back, leaving the two of them alone in the space between the river and the trees. He turned his back to them, a gesture of profound and deliberate privacy. Thassi Kamna closed the distance between them. He stopped just an arm's length from her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin and see the flecks of brown and gold in his dark eyes. He smelled of wood smoke and sage and the clean scent of the prairie. The air crackled with a quiet intensity. He looked at her, and the gravity of a generation's survival seemed to rest in his gaze. Then he spoke, not in Lakota, but in English. The words were slow, deliberate, shaped with the careful effort of a man speaking a language not his own. The accent was strong, but the meaning was unmistakable. "Carry my name." It was not a question. It was a statement, a request, an offering. It was a weight, a responsibility. He was not saying, "Let me save you." He was saying, "Stand with me and help me carry this." The breath of the wind from the river, the whisper of the cottonwood leaves, seemed to fall silent to hear her answer. In that moment, she was not the widow bride no man wanted. She was a woman being asked to bear a name of honor, to share the center of a world. Her own fear, the shame that had been her constant companion, seemed to shrink, to become a small, insignificant thing in the face of this immense, honest plea. She was no longer running away from Edward, from Philadelphia, from the ghost of her past. She was standing on the bank of a wild river, being asked to run toward a future, to take a deliberate step into the heart of the unknown. She found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. Yes. He gave a slow, solemn nod. The pact was made. He then gestured for Renville to return. The quiet intimacy of the moment was over, replaced once again by the formality of translation. There were terms to be settled. This was a partnership, and she would enter it as an equal. I have a condition, she said, her confidence growing. Renville translated. Thassi listened, his head tilted slightly. I will be a wife to him, and a partner, but I must have a voice. When I read the papers, and I see a trap, he must listen to my counsel. I will not be a silent mouth that only speaks his words. Thassi's answer came back immediately. He says a tool that cannot speak its purpose is a poor tool. A partner who cannot speak her mind is no partner. He agrees. And another, Caroline pressed, thinking of a future she had not dared to imagine until this very moment. If we are to have children, they must belong to both worlds. They will be raised as his people, but they will also learn to read the white man's words. They will learn to speak their father's tongue and their mother's. They must be able to walk in both worlds, or they will be torn apart by them. Renville relayed her demand. A new light came into Thassi's eyes. It was not surprise, but a deep, profound respect. He spoke at length, his voice full of a conviction that needed no translation. He says, Renville concluded, that this is the wisest thing you have said. This is the only way for the people to survive what is coming. He agrees. It will be so. Caroline felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She had not just been accepted. She had been heard. She had made her bargain not as a desperate refugee, but as a woman with value, with a mind, with a vision for the future. She looked at Thassi Kamna, at the quiet strength in his face, and she knew she had made her choice. It was a gamble, a desperate bet placed on the character of a man she did not know, in a world that was not her own, but it was her choice, a real choice, and for the first time in a very long time. Caroline Wolfe felt the solid ground of her own life beneath her feet. The days leading up to the ceremony were quiet, but charged with an unspoken significance. A new lodge was raised, a gift from the families of Thassi Kamna's warrior society. It stood slightly apart from the others, its poles fresh and pale against the sky, its hide covering new and smelling of wood smoke and curing herbs. It was a blank page, waiting for a life to be written upon it. Caroline worked alongside Wisela, her hands now accustomed to the rhythms of this life. She felt a nervous hum beneath her skin, the thrum of a future arriving faster than she could comprehend. 2 days before the ceremony, as Caroline was helping to pound dried choke cherries into a paste, Wisela left the lodge and returned a few moments later. She was not alone. With her was an older woman, her face a beautiful testament to a long life, every line a story. Her hair, though gray, was thick and neatly braided, and her eyes held a calm, deep wisdom. This was Wing Yang Waste, a woman of great respect, a keeper of traditions and a midwife to generations. In her arms, she carried a long, soft bundle wrapped in tanned deerskin. The two women approached Caroline, and Wing Yang Waste laid the bundle at her feet. With a gesture from Wisela, Caroline knelt and carefully untied the leather thongs. She folded back the deerskin to reveal a dress. It was made of the softest, most supple doeskin, the color of cream. It was heavy with intricate quill work across the yoke, patterns of suns and stars rendered in vibrant reds, blues, and yellows. A long fringe, each strand wrapped in dyed quills, hung from the sleeves and the hem. It was a garment of breathtaking beauty, a work of art that had taken a woman's lifetime of skill to create. But as Caroline looked closer, she saw that it was not new. The fringe was slightly worn at the hem, and there was a faint, almost invisible stain near the shoulder, a ghost of some long-ago feast. This was the dress of Maka, Wisela said, her voice softer than Caroline had ever heard it. Renville, who had entered the lodge quietly, translated from the doorway. She wore it when she joined my brother's lodge. It is a dress of a good wife, a strong mother. Caroline looked up, her heart catching in her throat. This was the dress of the woman who had come before her, the wife Thasi Kamna had loved. A cold knot of doubt tightened within her. Was she meant to be a replacement, a pale imitation of a cherished memory? As if sensing her thoughts, Wing Yang Waist knelt beside her. Her touch was surprisingly gentle as she rested a hand on Caroline's shoulder. She spoke in a low, melodic voice, her eyes kind. "The good woman says," Renville translated, his own voice imbued with the elder's solemnity, "that a path is not erased when a new traveler walks it. The path is honored. The dress does not ask you to be Maka. It asks you to be a wife worthy of the same path. It holds her strength. Now, it will hold yours." Understanding washed over Caroline, warm and profound. This was not an act of replacement, but of transmission. It was a handing down of a legacy, a weaving of her own unknown future into the strong fabric of the past. She was not stepping into a dead woman's shoes, but being given a map for the journey ahead. She looked at Wisela, at the sister who had guarded her brother's heart and his home with such fierce loyalty, and saw in her eyes a flicker of trust, hard-won and precious. Caroline reached out and touched the soft doe skin. "Tell them," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "that I will wear it with honor." On the morning of the ceremony, the entire camp gathered in a great circle in an open meadow by the river. The air was still and cool, smelling of damp earth and the sacred scent of burning sweetgrass. A holy man, ancient and frail but with eyes that burned with a fierce light, stood in the center. He wore a simple breechcloth, his weathered skin a canvas of sun and years. Caroline was led from Wisela's lodge by Wing Yang Waist. She wore Meka's dress. It felt heavy on her shoulders, a weight of history and expectation. Her hair was in two tight braids, interwoven with strips of otter fur. She was barefoot, her feet pressing into the cool, damp grass, connecting her to the earth. She walked toward the circle, and a hush fell over the assembled crowd. She could feel their eyes upon her, 100 pairs of eyes, a single, collective gaze of judgment and curiosity. They were the witnesses, the jury, the community that would either accept her or cast her out. From the opposite side of the circle, Thasi Kamna emerged. He was not dressed for war, but for peace and permanence. He wore leggings decorated with quill work that matched her dress, and a shirt of the finest antelope hide. In his hair was a single eagle feather. He walked with a quiet, powerful grace, his eyes fixed on the holy man in the center of the circle. They met before the holy man, who began to chant in a low, guttural voice that sounded less like words and more like the sounds of the earth itself, the rumble of distant thunder, the whisper of wind in a canyon. He purified them with the smoke of sage, waving a fan of feathers over their heads and hearts. Then he fell silent and looked at Thasi. He asked a question in a clear, ringing voice. He asks. Renville's voice came from just behind Caroline. "If you come to this woman of your own free will, to build a lodge with her and protect her as your partner." "Huh," Thasi said. The word was simple, but it resonated with absolute certainty. "Yes." Then the holy man turned his burning gaze on Caroline. He repeated the question. The Lakota word strange, but the meaning clear from his intent. Renville translated. He asks if you come to this man of your own free will, to stand with him and be a partner in his lodge. Caroline thought of Edward's cold, possessive hands, of the life of servitude she had fled. She thought of the honest bargain struck on the riverbank. This was the freest choice she had ever made. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing out in the silence, clear and unwavering. The holy man nodded. He gestured to two young men, who came forward bearing a massive buffalo robe, the winter coat of a great bull. It was immense, heavy, and radiated a primal power. The holy man took one end. Thassi took the other, and together they wrapped it around Caroline's shoulders, and then around Thassi's, binding them together. Suddenly, the world outside disappeared. They were enclosed in a small, warm, dark space, the thick hide muffling the sounds of the camp. They stood so close she could feel the steady beat of his heart through his chest. The air smelled of hide and smoke, and the man beside her. In the dim light, she could see the solemn set of his jaw, the deep concentration in his eyes. He was not looking at her, but straight ahead, as if seeing into the future they were now bound to share. They were alone together, a nation of two, wrapped in the symbol of his people's survival. The holy man's voice came to them, muffled but clear, as he offered a long prayer to Wakantanka, the great mystery. He prayed for strength, for children, for wisdom, for a lodge that would be warm and full of life. When the prayer ended, the robe was pulled away. They stood blinking in the bright sunlight, once again before the eyes of the people. The ceremony was over, but the trial was not. The holy man stepped back, and Thassi took Caroline's hand. His grip was firm and warm. They stood together, facing the circle of silent faces. No one spoke, no one moved. The entire camp seemed to be holding its breath, a single living entity, considering the strange union it had just witnessed. An old man stared, his face a mask of disapproval. A young woman looked at Caroline with open suspicion. A warrior watched, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible thing, a pressure building in the air. Caroline's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the moment of judgment. Had they gone through this sacred ritual only to be met with a wall of silent rejection? She felt a tremor of fear, but she met the gazes of the people, refusing to look away. She stood firm, her hand in Thassi's. Then, a single sound broke the stillness. It came from Wingyang Waste. It was a high, wavering cry, a trill that pierced the air like a hawk's call. For another heartbeat, there was silence. Then another woman, on the far side of the circle, answered with a cry of her own. A third joined in, and a fourth, and then suddenly the air erupted in a chorus of ululating cries from the women, a sound of pure, unbridled celebration. The men let out deep-throated calls of approval. The tension shattered, replaced by a wave of joyous sound that washed over Caroline, so powerful and unexpected that it brought tears to her eyes. It was acceptance. It was welcome. In the midst of the celebration, the holy man raised his hands for silence. The cries subsided, replaced by an expectant hush. He approached Caroline, his ancient eyes looking not at her, but through her, as if reading the story of her soul. He spoke, his voice carrying across the meadow. Renville stepped closer to translate. He says you came to us as a ghost, a woman with no name that held her own story. You left a life that was finished and crossed the great water of the plains to begin anew. You have stood before the people with a true heart. You will no longer be the woman who was. From this day forward, the people will call you Wichaglapi Natsing. Renville paused, letting the name settle. It means, he said, his voice full of a new respect. She who stands firm after returning. Wichaglapi Natsing, a name that was not a label, but a story, her story. It acknowledged her past sorrow and her present strength. It was a shield and a banner. It was the name she had earned. She looked at Thassi, and for the first time, she saw the hint of a smile touch the corners of his mouth. He squeezed her hand, a silent confirmation. They were one lodge, one family, before the eyes of the people who had, in a moment of conditional, hard-won grace, finally called her their own. The life of a bride gave way to the life of a wife, and the life of a wife was, first and foremost, a life of work. The beautiful doeskin dress was carefully wrapped and put away, a sacred object for sacred days. Her daily reality was a simpler, sturdier garment, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. her hands never idle. Their new lodge became her world. She learned its smells, the savory aroma of stew simmering over the fire, the clean scent of the sage she burned each morning, the faint, sweet smell of the new pine poles. At night, lying beside Thasikamna on the thick buffalo robes, she would listen to the sounds of his breathing, a steady and reassuring rhythm in the darkness. Their union was a quiet one, built on shared tasks and respectful silence more than on spoken endearments. He would watch her work, a flicker of approval in his eyes when she mastered a new skill. She would watch him as he mended a weapon or spoke in counsel, admiring the calm authority that settled on him like a mantle. Then the wind changed. It lost its warm, dusty breath and acquired a sharp, cutting edge that spoke of the high peaks to the west. The deep green of the cottonwood leaves faded to a brittle yellow, and the river ran clearer and colder. Winter was not an arrival. It was an invasion. The first snowfall came silently in the night, a soft white blanket that transformed the world, muffling all sound and making the familiar landscape strange and new. It was beautiful, but it was also a warning. The season of learning was over. The season of survival had begun. The work intensified. Wingyang Waste became Caroline's primary teacher, a mentor whose lessons were delivered not in words but in actions. She brought a freshly butchered deer hide to the lodge, stiff and bloody, and laid it on the ground. She handed Caroline a fleshing tool made from a sharpened leg bone. Then, with powerful, economic strokes, she began to scrape away the fat and muscle, her movements a blur of practiced efficiency. She gestured for Caroline to do the same. Caroline's first attempts were clumsy and weak. The tool skidded uselessly, and the work was nauseating. But Wingyang Waste was a patient, if exacting, teacher. She would correct Caroline's grip, adjust the angle of her body, and with a simple grunt, indicate when she was doing it right. The work was brutal. It stained her clothes and caked under her fingernails. Her hands, soft from a lifetime of indoor work, bled from a dozen small cuts and scrapes. At night, they throbbed with a fiery pain. Tasi would watch her rubbing them with grease and say nothing. But one evening he returned from a walk and placed a pair of heavy hide work gloves beside her sleeping robes. It was a gesture of care so profound in its silent understanding that it touched her more than any spoken poetry could have. Slowly, her hands toughened. The blisters gave way to a layer of hard, protective skin. The pain subsided, replaced by the satisfying ache of well-used muscles. These new hands, scarred and calloused, felt more truly hers than the pale, useless things she had brought with her from Philadelphia. They were a testament to her endurance, a badge of honor she had earned with her own sweat and blood. After the scraping and tanning came the sewing. Wingyang Waste showed her how to use a sharp bone awl to punch holes in the supple, brain-tanned leather and how to thread a needle with sinew. Her first stitches were crooked and uneven. She was tasked with making a simple pouch, and her first attempt was a lumpy, misshapen thing that made the children giggle. But she persevered, her brow furrowed in concentration, unpicking her mistakes and starting again. She learned to sew a watertight seam, her stitches becoming smaller and more precise. Her first successful project was a pair of winter moccasins. She worked on them in secret in the evenings, her head bent low in the firelight. When they were finished, she lined them with soft rabbit fur and presented them to Thasi. He took them, examined the neatness of the seams, and then slowly, deliberately, took off his old, worn pair and put on the new ones. He stood and walked a few paces, then looked at her and gave a single, solemn nod of approval. In that moment, Caroline felt a surge of pride that was fierce and pure. She had created something useful, something beautiful, something that would warm the feet of her husband against the winter snows. She was no longer just a reader of words. She was a maker of things. Her education in the Lakota language came from the most unlikely of teachers, the children. They were drawn to her, this quiet, pale-skinned woman with the strange accent. They found her attempts to speak their language endlessly amusing. A small boy with eyes as bright as obsidian beads would point to his nose. Fasu, he would say. Caroline would repeat it, and the children would shriek with laughter at her clumsy pronunciation. But it was a kind laughter, and they would correct her, shouting the word over and over until she got it right. They taught her through games of tag, shouting the words for run and stop and tree. They taught her the names of the birds and the animals, and the lullabies their mothers sang to them. From them, she learned the music of the language, its playful, living heart, a lesson the adults in their solemnity could not have taught her. As the days grew shorter and the cold deepened, her primary purpose, the reason for her journey, began to take shape. The hunters went out, their excursions longer and more arduous in the deep snow. But they returned with meat. The camp had enough to eat, but the treaty goods promised by the agents at the fort floor, sugar, coffee, and blankets were scarce. A trader might arrive with a fraction of the promised supplies, offering excuses about bad weather or trouble on the trail. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, its voice a low moan against the hide of the lodge, Thasi sat staring into the fire, his face grim. He had spent the day in council with the other leaders, and a heavy silence had followed him home. He reached into a parfleche case and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a receipt from the agent at Fort Laramie, given to him on his last visit before the snows came. He handed it to her. "What do these marks say?" he asked, his voice low. Caroline took the paper. It was the first time he had asked her to do this, the first test of their bargain. She smoothed it on her knee and angled it toward the firelight. Her reading skills, once a source of quiet pleasure, now felt like a heavy responsibility. The agent's handwriting was a careless scrawl, but the words were clear enough. It was a list of goods designated for Thasi's band. "It says 100 sacks of flour," she read slowly, 50 pounds of coffee, 100 pounds of sugar, 200 blankets. Thasi was silent for a long moment. "The last trader," he said, his voice flat and hard, "brought us 20 sacks of flour, 10 pounds of coffee, no sugar, 50 blankets." He said the rest was delayed. The seed of conflict, cold and hard as a frozen stone, settled in Caroline's stomach. "This paper says the full amount was sent from the big fort down the river. It says it was signed for at Fort Laramie 2 months ago." She looked up from the paper and met his gaze. She saw no surprise in his eyes, only the confirmation of a long and bitter suspicion. The white men's words, spoken with smiles in the summer sun, were not the same as the marks they made on their papers in the winter darkness. "There is more," she said, her voice dropping. "The trader who was here last week, the one who smelled of whiskey, he spoke of a new treaty the soldiers want everyone to sign in the spring. He said it would be a good treaty, that it would guarantee more food and keep the miners out of the sacred hills." And the agent at the Fort Thasi asked, "Did he speak of this new treaty?" "No," Caroline said. "This paper speaks only of the old treaty, the one signed many years ago. It says these goods are the full payment for this year, as agreed." The lie was there, coiled in the space between the spoken word and the written one. The trader's easy promises of a better future, and the agent's official paper claiming all debts were paid, both could not be true. The discrepancy was a chasm, and Caroline felt as though she were standing on the edge of it, looking down into a darkness that threatened to swallow them all. Thasi continued to stare into the fire, his silence more profound and dangerous than any angry shout. He was a leader, a man of his people, and she knew he was not just thinking of the missing flour and sugar. He was thinking of the future, of the web of words and lies being woven around them, a web she was now uniquely positioned to see. The winter was a battle against the cold and the snow, a battle of endurance they knew how to fight. But a new war was coming, she realized, a war of ink and paper, of promises and betrayals, and it would be fought not with arrows and rifles, but with the careful reading of a fine-print lie. The long winter finally broke its grip. The snow receded, leaving the earth soft and smelling of new life. The North Platte River, freed from its prison of ice, swelled into a muddy, muscular torrent. With the spring came a summons A message arrived from Fort Laramie, carried by a nervous young soldier who did not linger. The new agent, a man named Morrison, wished to hold a council to discuss the new treaty that had been hinted at all winter. A treaty, the message said, that would ensure peace and prosperity for all. The delegation that traveled to the fort was small and solemn. Tassi Kamna rode at its head, his face impassive. With him were 3 other leaders, men whose faces were etched with the wisdom of many hard seasons. Joseph Renville rode with them, his expression uneasy. And at the rear of the party, riding a steady pony Wichella had chosen for her, was Caroline. She was no longer Wichaglapi Natsing, the new bride, but a part of the council itself, her mind the shield they were bringing to this war of words. Her presence was a silent declaration we will no longer be blind. The air at Fort Laramie was different than it had been on her arrival. The casual contempt had been replaced by a tense, watchful hostility. The soldiers stopped their drills to stare as the Lakota delegation, with a white woman among them, rode through the main gate. Their eyes lingered on Caroline, and the looks were a mixture of disbelief and accusation. Traitor. That was the word she saw in their gazes. They were shown not to an open council ground, but to a small, airless office in the main administrative building. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke, leather-bound books, and a faint, sour scent of authority. Agent Morrison rose from behind a large oak desk as they entered. He was a portly man with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes that darted about, never resting long on any one person. He offered a wide, wet smile that did not touch his eyes. He said it was an honor to welcome such esteemed leaders to the fort. He spoke of a new era of cooperation, a future of shared prosperity. His words were smooth and round, polished stones meant to soothe and distract. The Lakota leaders listened, their faces like carved mahogany, giving nothing away. Caroline stood near the back, by the wall, her presence unacknowledged by the agent, who seemed to have decided she was an irrelevant curiosity. Morrison gestured to a thick document bound in blue paper lying on his desk. He said that he had before him the new treaty from the Great Father in Washington. He explained that it contained a few minor adjustments to the old agreements, small changes to the maps and schedules of goods, all designed to make things more efficient and prevent misunderstandings. He patted the document as if it were a sleeping dog. He assured them it was a very generous proposal. Thassi spoke, his voice calm and even. Renville translated. He said that they had heard many spoken words over the years. Today, they wished to hear the words of the paper. A flicker of annoyance crossed Morrison's face, but he kept his smile in place. He said that, of course, he would be happy to explain the key points. The document was full of legal language, very complicated, and he would not want to bore them with the tedious details. His tone was deeply condescending, the voice of a man explaining a complex idea to a group of slow children. An old chief named Forehorn spoke then, his voice a dry rasp. He said that they were not afraid of being bored, they were afraid of being cheated. Morrison's smile tightened. He told them his word as a representative of the United States government was their guarantee. He picked up the document but did not open it. It was time. Caroline felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach, but she pushed it down. This was the work she had come here to do. She took a step forward. All eyes in the room turned to her. She spoke in English, her voice clear and steady in the stuffy room. I am Wichaglapi Natsing, the wife of Thassi Kamna. My husband has asked me to read the paper. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Morrison's jaw went slack. His florid face darkened with a rush of blood. He stared at her as if she had sprouted a second head. He had seen her only as a piece of property, a savage's curious pet. He had not imagined she could speak, let alone read. He sputtered that this was a council of men, a government matter. It was not a place for a woman. Thassi Kamna took a single, deliberate step forward, so that he stood beside Caroline. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He said that this woman was his partner. Her eyes were his eyes. Her voice was his voice. They would hear the paper. Morrison was trapped. To refuse a direct request from a white woman, however misplaced he thought she was, would be a breach of his own culture's etiquette. To deny her in front of the Lakota leaders would be to admit he was afraid of what the paper said. With a look of pure venom directed at Caroline, he shoved the document across the polished surface of the desk. She stepped forward and picked it up. Her hands were steady, but her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She opened the blue cover. The pages were filled with dense, spidery script, a thicket of legal terms designed to obscure, not to clarify. She began to read. She read in a low voice. For her own understanding first, her eyes scanning the paragraphs. Then she would look up, her gaze meeting Thassy's, and speak the plain truth of the words to Renville, who would then translate them into the Lakota tongue. The first article, she explained, spoke of boundaries. She traced a line on the map appended to the document. The trader had spoken of guaranteeing their lands. This paper did the opposite. It ceded to the United States all rights to the land north of the river, including the entire Powder River Basin, their richest hunting ground. In exchange, the treaty promised continued rations. They were being asked to sell their birthright for sacks of flour. A low murmur went through the Lakota leaders, their faces already grim, hardened into masks of cold fury. Caroline continued to the next article. It granted a perpetual and unrestricted right-of-way to the railroad, a 2-mile-wide corridor that would cut directly through their winter camping grounds. It also granted the Army the right to build forts anywhere along that corridor to protect it. It was not a path, it was a scar, and it was a cage. She translated the third article, her voice dropping with the weight of it. It restricted their right to hunt buffalo to a small, designated territory far to the south. To hunt elsewhere, even on their own remaining land, would be considered an act of aggression against the United States. It was a sentence of slow starvation. Morrison sat behind his desk, his face a thunderous mask. His pretense of friendship had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, simmering rage. He watched Caroline, his eyes narrowed into hateful slits. The final article was the most insidious trap of all. It stated that if any single member of the Lakota Nation was found guilty of a crime against a white person, as judged by a military tribunal, all provisions of the treaty, including the promised rations, would be immediately and permanently forfeit. However, if a white person committed a crime against a Lakota, the matter would be handled by civilian courts far to the east. It was a contract with no accountability on one side and total liability on the other. When she finished, a dead silence filled the room. The air was thick with betrayal, so heavy it was difficult to breathe. Caroline had not just translated a document, she had detonated a bomb. She had held the truth up like a mirror, and the reflection was ugly and monstrous. Morrison was the first to break the silence. He slammed his hand down on the desk, the sound like a gunshot in the small room. He surged to his feet, his face purple with fury. He bellowed that this was an act of sedition. He accused her of twisting the words, of filling their heads with lies. He called her a traitor to her own race, a woman who had shamed her family and her God. He turned his rage on the chiefs. He told them they were ungrateful. The government offered them peace and civilization, and they threw it back in his face. He pointed a trembling finger toward the window, in the direction of the parade ground. He said he had 500 soldiers at this fort. He had cannons that could turn their entire village to dust in an hour. He shouted that they would sign the treaty. It was not a request. It was an order. They could have the paper, or they could have the bullet. The choice was theirs. The Lakota leaders rose as one, a silent, powerful movement. The argument was over. The lie had been exposed, but the truth did not matter here. Morrison had lost the debate, but he had the power, and he was not afraid to use it. Thassi Kamna looked not at Morrison, but at Caroline. His eyes were full of a terrible, cold fire, but in them, She also saw a flicker of respect so profound it made her want to weep. She had done the work. She had honored her bargain. But in keeping her promise to him, she had brought the certainty of violence down upon them all. Thasi spoke a single sentence in Lakota, his voice like the chipping of flint. Renville did not need to translate. The meaning was clear in his tone. "We will not sign." Then they turned and walked out of the room. Caroline followed, her legs unsteady beneath her. They walked out of the building and into the harsh sunlight of the parade ground. Every soldier they passed now seemed to be holding a weapon. The American flag, snapping in the wind on its high pole, looked less like a symbol of freedom and more like the banner of an invading army. The war had begun. It had been declared not with a drum or a bugle, but with the scratching of a pen on a piece of paper in a small, dark room. They returned to the camp under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The news of the failed council, of Morrison's open threat, spread not like a fire but like a frost, chilling the heart of the community. There was no panic, no outcry. Instead, a quiet, methodical preparation began. The warriors checked their weapons. The women packed essential supplies into parfleche cases, dried meat, medicines, extra moccasins. It was the grim, practiced efficiency of a people who knew that peace was a temporary season, and violence was the returning winter. In the pre-dawn grayness of the third day, Caroline awoke to a profound stillness. Even the birds were silent. A wave of sickness, a familiar companion these past few weeks, washed over her. She pressed a hand against her abdomen, a gesture that was becoming an unconscious habit. A secret, precious and terrifying, was growing within her. A child of two worlds, conceived in a union of hope, now destined to be born into a war. The thought gave her a strength that was fierce and elemental. It was the strength of a she-wolf defending her den. A single rifle shot shattered the silence. It was followed by a volley, a ripping sound that tore the fabric of the morning. Then came the thunder of hooves, the high panicked whinny of a horse, and a human scream that was cut brutally short. Chaos erupted. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the terrible, suffocating scent of burning hide. Thasi was already on his feet, his knife in one hand, his rifle in the other. He moved with a lethal calm that cut through the pandemonium. He met her eyes in the flickering orange light of their burning lodge. His voice was not a shout, but a sharp, urgent command for her to go to his sister. He told her to take the women and the children to the dry creek bed behind the camp. It was their designated escape route, a path that would lead them toward the foothills. She saw him turn to join the handful of warriors who were forming a desperate line of defense, trying to buy time for the others to flee. A blue-coated soldier on a charging horse raised his carbine. Caroline saw the puff of smoke before she heard the crack of the gun. Thasi staggered, a dark stain blossoming on his shoulder. He did not fall. He spun, raised his own rifle, and fired. The soldier tumbled from his saddle. Thasi looked back at her one last time, his face a mask of pain and grim determination. He pointed again, fiercely, toward the river. "Go, now!" Her heart seized with a terror so cold it felt like death, but the life inside her screamed a louder command live. She turned and ran, her feet stumbling over the familiar ground that had become a landscape of nightmares. She found Wisela already marshaling the terrified women and children. The older woman was a rock in the swirling torrent of fear. Her voice was sharp, her hands firm, pushing a crying child toward its mother, pointing a group of older women toward the safety of the riverbank. She was not a warrior with a rifle. She was a commander of logistics, a general of survival, and her battlefield was the collapsing heart of their world. Caroline grabbed the hand of a small boy who was standing frozen, his face streaked with tears. She pulled him along, her eyes scanning for other lost children. She joined a human chain of women, passing toddlers and infants from hand to hand, down the steep, crumbling bank into the relative safety of the dry creek. The air above them was a hell of smoke and noise. But down here, shielded by the high earth walls, there was a pocket of strained, breathless quiet. They huddled there, listening to the sounds of the battle raging above. The gunfire was sporadic now. The shouting had faded. A terrible silence began to fall, a silence that was worse than the noise. Wesela, her face streaked with soot, her eyes burning with a cold fire, gave the order to move. Their flight was a blur of exhaustion and fear. They followed the winding path of the creek bed, the loose gravel shifting under their feet. They moved as quickly as they could, half running, half stumbling, carrying the smallest children and helping the elders. Caroline's lungs burned, and a sharp pain stitched her side. But she kept moving, her hand resting on her belly, her every step a prayer. Live. We must live. When they finally emerged from the creek bed into the broken country of the foothills, the sun was high in the sky. Caroline looked back. A thick column of greasy black smoke coiled into the serene blue sky. A funeral pyre for their homes, their possessions, their past, everything they had built, everything they had been just that morning, was gone, turned to ash and memory. The next 3 days were a waking nightmare. They had no fire. To light one would be to send a signal to any pursuing soldiers. They walked from before dawn until after dusk, stopping only for the briefest of rests. The nights were the worst. The spring air was deceptively cold, and without the warmth of a fire or the thick insulation of their lodges, the chill seeped deep into their bones. They huddled together for warmth, a miserable mass of shivering humanity, listening to the sounds of the night, every snap of a twig, every call of a distant coyote, sending a fresh jolt of fear through them. Their food was a handful of dried berries and tough strips of jerky that the women had stuffed into their belts as they fled. It was not enough. A gnawing hunger became their constant companion. The children, blessedly, were mostly silent, their fear having stunned them into a quiet obedience. The women bore the hardship with a stoic endurance that amazed Caroline. They did not complain. They shared their meager rations, comforted the frightened, and tended to the few who had suffered minor injuries in the escape. Wikela was their heart, their spine. She scouted ahead, found small seeps of water for them to drink, and set a relentless pace. She drove them onward with a will of iron, her own grief locked away behind a mask of grim resolve. Caroline found a strength she did not know she possessed. She helped carry the children when their small legs gave out. She gave her own small portion of water to an elderly woman who was beginning to falter. She was no longer an outsider. She was a woman of the Oglala, and she was fleeing the ashes of her home alongside her sisters. Her fear for Thasi was a constant, agonizing ache in her chest, a wound she could not tend to. Was he alive? Was he wounded? Was he a captive? She pushed the questions away. To dwell on them was to invite a despair that would paralyze her. She had to survive. For him. For the child. On the evening of the third day, as the last of the light bled from the sky, Wesela led them into a narrow, hidden canyon. The walls rose steeply on either side, and the entrance was choked with a thick stand of pine, making it nearly invisible from the open plains. Inside, the canyon opened into a small, sheltered valley with a spring-fed pool of clear, cold water. There were caves honeycombing the canyon walls, dark and deep. It was a natural fortress, a sanctuary. They had arrived. A wave of exhaustion so profound that it was almost painful washed over Caroline. She sank to the ground, her body trembling with fatigue. The other women and children collapsed around her, their ordeal finally over. They did not have to wait long. A sentry, an old man who had been left to guard the refuge, emerged from the shadows. Soon after, the first of the warriors began to arrive. They came not as a proud war party, but as the grim survivors of a terrible defeat. They came in ones and twos, limping, their faces blackened with smoke, their eyes hollow with what they had seen. Several were wounded, supported by their comrades. With each new arrival, a woman would rise and go to meet her husband, her brother, her son. The reunions were hushed, desperate affairs, a touch of a hand, a quiet murmur of a name. Relief mingled with the unspoken grief for those who would not be returning. Caroline waited, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She scanned each new face that emerged from the twilight, searching for the one she needed to see. The shadows deepened. The last group of warriors entered the canyon, and then she saw him. He was supported by another man, his left arm bound tightly to his chest with a strip of torn blanket. His face was pale beneath the soot, and he walked with the stiff, careful gait of a man in great pain. But he was alive. He was here. She rose, her legs unsteady, and walked toward him. He saw her, and his eyes, weary and full of pain, locked on hers. The other warrior stepped away, leaving them alone. They did not speak. There were no words for this. She reached out and gently touched his uninjured arm, her fingers tracing the tense line of his muscle. He looked at her, his gaze taking in her torn dress, her scratched face, her exhaustion. Then his eyes dropped, just for a second, to where her hand rested protectively on her own body. In that fleeting glance, a universe of understanding passed between them. He knew, in the midst of the fire and the blood and the death, he saw the promise of life, a small, fierce hope in the heart of their shared despair. He raised his good hand and covered hers, his touch a silent vow. They had lost everything, but they were together, and they had a future to fight for. The sanctuary in the high canyon was a reprieve, not a solution. It was a place to bind wounds and mourn the dead, but it was not a place to live. The hunters ranged farther each day, returning with less. The stored supplies dwindled with alarming speed. The first casualty of their new life was not to a soldier's bullet, but to the slow, creeping siege of hunger. The children's laughter grew quieter, their face thinner. The elders sat wrapped in their robes, conserving an energy they no longer had. The crisis was a quiet one, a gnawing emptiness in the belly that mirrored the emptiness of their burned camp. It was this creeping starvation that made the arrival of the messenger possible. He was a lone soldier, carrying a white flag, who was met by Lakota scouts far out on the plains. He brought not a demand for surrender, but an invitation to a new council. Agent Morrison had been recalled. The message stated, his actions deemed excessive. A new commission had been sent from the east to establish a true and lasting peace. The names on the letter were Agent Richardson, a man from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Colonel Thornton, the ranking military commander, and a lawyer named Hewitt. The offer was met with deep and bitter suspicion. The leaders gathered in the largest of the caves, their faces illuminated by a single, smoky fire. They had heard these words before. Peace, prosperity, trust. They were the sweet bait that concealed the iron jaws of the trap. But Four Horns, his voice weak with hunger, spoke the hard truth. A man can die with honor fighting, he said, his voice a dry whisper. But to watch your grandchildren starve while you do nothing is not an honorable death. Thasi Kamna listened, his face a study in grim pragmatism. He looked at Caroline, who sat with the women just outside the circle of men. Her pregnancy was undeniable now, the gentle swell of her belly a constant, visible reminder of the future they were all fighting for. His gaze held hers for a long moment. They had to try, for the children who were, and for the one who was to come. He stood and announced his decision. They would go. The journey back to Fort Laramie was a ghost of their previous trip. They were not a proud delegation, but a band of refugees negotiating for their survival. Yet, there was no subservience in their demeanor. They rode with their backs straight, their eyes clear, their dignity intact. They were survivors, and they had come to speak the truth. This time, they were met with a rigid, formal courtesy. The new men were waiting for them in the same stuffy office, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Agent Richardson was a thin, bird-like man with spectacles perched on his nose and hands stained with ink. He was a creature of paper and procedure. Colonel Thornton was a career soldier, his uniform immaculate, his face weary, the face of a man who understood the true cost of the orders he was given. Lawyer Hewitt was the most formidable of the three. He was a quiet, watchful man with intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His words were few, but they were precise, each one a carefully chosen tool. There was no condescension in their greeting, no hollow talk of the Great Father. This was a negotiation, and it began with a stark admission. The actions taken against your camp were unauthorized and regrettable, Colonel Thornton began, his voice devoid of emotion. Our purpose here is not to excuse what was done, but to ensure it does not happen again. We are here to create a treaty that both sides can live with. For 3 days, they argued. The debate was a stark and brutal accounting of the long history of broken promises. Lawyer Hewitt would speak of legal jurisdiction and land grants. Agent Richardson would speak of logistics, of the number of people, the amount of supplies. Colonel Thornton would speak of the realities of his position, of the miners and settlers pushing west, a tide he was ordered to manage, not to stop. And through it all, Caroline sat beside Thassi, her mind a bridge, her voice a conduit. She translated the complex legal clauses, the cold bureaucratic language, into plain, honest Lakota, and she translated the passionate, eloquent speeches of the chiefs, their demands for the return of their sacred Paha Sapa, their right to follow the great buffalo herds, into the formal, dispassionate English the commissioners required. She was a fulcrum, balancing the weight of 2 worlds, and the strain was immense. The baby was heavy within her, and a deep, aching weariness had settled into her bones. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they were arguing over the precise wording of the hunting rights clause. Whit was insisting on specific, limited seasons. Thassi was arguing that the seasons could not be dictated by a calendar, but only by the movement of the herds. The air in the room was thick with the tension of a dozen irresolvable conflicts. Suddenly, a sharp, invisible hand seized Caroline's lower back and twisted. She gasped. Her hand flying to her belly, the men stopped talking, all eyes turning to her. She tried to smile, to wave it away as a momentary discomfort. But then another spasm came, stronger this time, a wave of pressure that stole her breath. She looked at Thassi, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. A dark, warm wetness spread through the layers of her skirt. The treaty, the boundaries, the entire political fate of the Lakota nation, all of it dissolved in the face of a reality that was older and more powerful than any government. The room erupted in a quiet, stunned chaos. Agent Richardson, a man who lived by the predictable order of ink on paper, looked utterly helpless. Colonel Thornton, who had faced cannon fire without flinching, seemed deeply alarmed. He immediately offered the services of the fort's doctor. Thassi rose to his full height. He placed a protective hand on Caroline's shoulder. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it filled the room with an authority that was absolute. Ranville translated, his own voice tight with the drama of the moment. "She is my wife. Our child will be born in the Lakota way. She will not go to your doctor." He helped Caroline to her feet. She was trembling, another contraction already building within her. He led her from the room, leaving the 3 commissioners staring after them, their treaty negotiations shattered by an event for which there was no legal precedent. He did not take her far, just outside the walls of the fort, on a small patch of unclaimed grass near the river. The Lakota who had traveled with them erected a small, temporary teepee. It was a defiant act, a declaration of sovereignty in the very shadow of the fort's power. They would not beg for shelter. They would create their own. Inside, the world of men and politics vanished. Wing-Yang Waste and Waisela were there, their presence a calm and steadying anchor in the storm of her pain. They bathed her face with cool water, spoke to her in low, soothing tones, and held her hands when the contractions came, one after another. like a relentless tide. This was a world of women, a world of life-giving, and its power was ancient and absolute. Through a long night of agony and effort, with the quiet, expert guidance of the women who had become her family, Caroline brought her son into the world. He was small and perfect. His first cry a thin, reedy sound that was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. The next morning, the sun rose on a changed world. The commissioners, weary and uncertain, had reassembled in the office. They did not know how to proceed. The door opened. Caroline walked in. She was pale, her face etched with the exhaustion of her ordeal, but her back was straight, in her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket. She carried her newborn son. Thassi walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back, a silent, steady support. She walked to the negotiating table and sat down in her chair. She looked at the three powerful men who stared at her, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. The air in the room was electric with a new kind of silence. The arguments of the previous day, the talk of boundaries and clauses and legal statutes, seemed like the petty squabbles of children in the face of the profound, undeniable miracle she held in her arms. She had brought the future into the room. Colonel Thornton was the first to find his voice. It was raspy and full of a respect that had not been there before. "Madam," he said, his eyes on the tiny, sleeping infant, "perhaps we can conclude our business." The negotiations that followed were different. The hard edges of the debate had been softened. An urgency had entered the room, a shared, unspoken understanding that they were no longer just dividing up land. They were building a world for a child to live in. The treaty they signed that afternoon was a painful compromise, but it was a livable one. The land they were given was smaller than what they had lost, but it was a large, contiguous territory, and their seasonal rights to hunt in their old grounds, though restricted, were explicitly preserved. And then Caroline, her voice weak but firm, insisted on one final clause: all treaty goods, every sack of flour, every blanket, every pound of coffee, would be inventoried upon delivery. The manifest would not be considered valid until it bore the signature of an official representative of the Lakota Nation. Lawyer Hewitt looked up from his papers. And who would that representative be? Thassi Kamna looked at his wife, at the son sleeping in her arms. He did not need Renville to translate his answer. "She will be," he said. "And so it was written into the treaty." They pushed the document across the table. Agent Richardson offered a pen. Caroline shifted the baby in her arms, took the pen, and signed her name, Wichaglapi Natsing. The ink was dark and permanent on the paper, a promise of accountability. Beside it, a tiny drop of her son's milk, leaking from the folds of her dress, fell onto the page, a small, pale circle. The two marks sat side by side, the law of men and the law of life, one to feed the body, the other to feed a people's hope. They returned to the mountain canyon not as a defeated people, but as a nation that had stared into the abyss and forced it to blink. The news of the treaty spread through the small, sheltered valley. There was no wild celebration, no victory dance. The losses had been too great, the cost too high. Instead, that evening, a single, large fire was lit in the center of the camp. The people gathered, their faces gaunt, but their eyes clear in the flickering light. A drum began to beat, a slow, deep, and steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the land itself. An old man offered a prayer of thanks, his voice raspy with emotion, not for a victory, but for survival. They had not won, they had endured. And in their midst, passed from hand to hand, was the infant son of Thassi Kamna and Wichaglapi Natsing, a small, tangible promise that their endurance had not been in vain. They named him Tasunka, for the horse, the animal that gave them the freedom to move, to flee, to survive. When the next season turned, they did not return to the ashes of their old camp by the river. That place was a graveyard of memory. Instead, they moved to a wide, protected valley deep within the borders of their new territory. A new kind of life began to take root there. a life of cautious adaptation. The familiar, graceful shapes of the high teepees rose first, a testament to their enduring traditions. But alongside them, a few families began to build simple, sturdy log cabins, their axes ringing out in the clear mountain air. It was a concession to the permanence of the new reality, a blending of the nomadic spirit with the settled future the treaty demanded. Their community was no longer just a circle of lodges, but a village of hide and wood, a physical manifestation of their compromised peace. Caroline's role in this new world was unique and vital. Once a month, she would make the 2-day journey to Fort Laramie, her son securely bundled in a cradleboard on her back. She no longer entered the fort as a supplicant or a pariah, but as an official representative. She would ride through the main gate, her back straight, and the soldiers who had once stared at her with contempt now offered a grudging, uncertain respect. She was the woman of the treaty, the keeper of the ledger, and her signature held the power of law. Each visit followed a ritual. She would meet with Agent Richardson in his office, the baby sleeping quietly in a corner. The agent, a man who found comfort in the predictable order of bureaucracy, treated her with a formal, correct politeness. Together, they would go to the supply depot, where a young, wary sergeant would oversee the counting of the goods. Caroline would stand with her ledger, a thick, leather-bound book, and make a mark for every sack of flour, every bolt of cloth, every crate of tools. One hot summer afternoon, a conflict arose. The manifest from the regional command listed 50 heavy wool blankets. The sergeant and his men unloaded only 40. A clerical error. "Ma'am," the sergeant said, wiping sweat from his brow. He was a young man, eager to be done with the business. The other 10 must have been offloaded at another post. I will make a note of it. Caroline did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply looked at him, her expression calm, and then at the manifest in her hands. The manifest says 50 blankets were signed for by your quartermaster at Fort Phil Kearney. The treaty says this band is to receive 50 blankets this month. I cannot sign the ledger until I have counted 50 blankets. The sergeant's face flushed. "Now see here, it is just 10 blankets." "It is the treaty," Caroline said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "The words on the paper are the only things keeping the peace. If the words are a lie, the peace is a lie." She closed her ledger. "I will wait." She sat on a nearby crate, nursed her son, and waited. An hour passed. Agent Richardson was summoned. He and the sergeant had a heated, private conversation. Finally. The sergeant, his face a mask of sullen resentment, went into the back of the depot and returned with 10 more blankets. They were of a slightly inferior quality, clearly from a different shipment, but there were 10 of them. Caroline counted them, made her final mark in the ledger, and then, with a firm, clear hand, signed her name at the bottom of the page. The matter was settled. The treaty had held. This was the nature of their new peace, a fragile structure that required constant vigilance. Minor disputes would flare up. A settler's cow would wander onto treaty land and be killed for food. A young Lakota hunter, his spirit chafing against the invisible lines on the map, would track a deer into the hills beyond the border. Each incident was a potential spark. Caroline, with Thasse's counsel and her unique position, became the mediator. She would speak to the nervous soldiers with the authority of the treaty's language, and she would speak to the restless young men of her adopted people with the quiet authority of her place in their community. She was not a chief, but she was the keeper of the words, and her reputation for fairness, for seeing the truth on both sides, became a powerful tool for de-escalating tensions before they could ignite. The years passed. The long, difficult work of healing and rebuilding continued. Thasse's shoulder healed, but it left him with a deep, puckered scar and a permanent stiffness. He could no longer draw a powerful war bow with the same effortless strength. The injury, a constant reminder of the price of their survival, guided him toward a new role. He became a teacher. He gathered the young boys, the ones who had been small children during the attack, and he began to train them. He taught them not just how to track and hunt, but how to be patient, how to be disciplined, how to think. He was molding the next generation of leaders, men who would need to be as skilled in negotiation as they were in the hunt, as wise as they were strong. Their family grew. A daughter was born, a bright, curious girl they named Anpao, the Dawn. 2 years later, another son arrived. Their home, a large, airy cabin built near the creek, was a blend of two worlds. Buffalo robes lay on the plank floors. A cast-iron stove stood not far from a traditional fire pit, and the air was always filled with a fluid mixture of Lakota and English. The children slipped between the two languages as easily as they ran from the cabin to the creek. They were living proof of the pact their parents had made, a bridge of flesh and blood between two cultures. The prejudices and old hatreds did not simply vanish. They lingered, a persistent, low-grade fever on both sides of the treaty line. Some of the older Lakota still looked at Caroline's children, with their lighter hair and paler skin, with a certain suspicion. And in the settlements that were springing up along the railroad line, she was still spoken of as the white woman who had turned her back on her own kind. But the sharp, violent edge of the conflict had been blunted. They had created a space, a small, fiercely protected bubble of less bad, where their children could grow up without the constant, immediate threat of violence. Adaptation, Caroline learned, was not the same as surrender. It was a strategy for survival, a way to hold onto the core of what mattered while the world changed around you. One evening, as the first chill of autumn settled over the valley, Caroline sat by the fire, mending a small pair of moccasins for her youngest son. Thasi was nearby, quietly showing their daughter how to fletch an arrow. Tasunke, now a sturdy boy of 5, was tracing the letters on a slate with a piece of charcoal. Caroline finished her stitching and set the moccasin down. Beside it lay a small pair of leather shoes she had painstakingly crafted for him to wear on their trips to the fort. The 2 pairs of shoes, one for each of his worlds, sat side by side in the firelight. It was a simple, domestic scene, a moment of peace so profound and so dearly bought that it made her heart ache with a fierce, protective love. Thasi looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the small space. He glanced at the children, at the warm, safe lodge around them, and then his hand went unconsciously to the scar on his shoulder. He did not need to speak. She understood. This was what they had fought for. Not for land, not for pride, not for victory, but for this, for the right to sit by a warm fire, to watch their children grow, to mend a small pair of shoes for a journey into a world they were trying, against all odds, to make safe. 5 years. It was a span of time that felt both impossibly long and as brief as a single breath. From her place on the hill overlooking the valley, Caroline could measure those years in the landscape below. She could see them in the silvered, weathered logs of the first cabins they had built, their roofs now greened with moss. She could see them in the smoke that rose from a dozen fires, a sign of hearths that were now well established, no longer temporary. The graceful cones of the tipis still stood among the solid angles of the wooden homes, a testament to the blended world they had forged, a world that honored the past while cautiously building a future. She watched the life of the village unfold below her. A group of children, her own son Tasunke among them, chased a yapping dog near the creek, their laughter carrying on the crisp autumn air. A line of women, their backs straight and strong, walked back from the stream, carrying heavy water skins. Their chatter was a low, pleasant murmur, the sound of a community at peace with its daily rhythms. It was an ordinary scene, a simple tableau of life, and yet, to Caroline, it was a miracle, a fragile masterpiece painted on a canvas of hard-won survival. Every line on this map of their life had been drawn with struggle. Every cabin stood on ground that had been paid for with blood and sorrow. The peace they now enjoyed was not a gift freely given, but a treaty held together by the constant, diligent pressure of their own vigilance. It was a living thing, this peace, and it had to be fed with honesty and guarded with courage every single day. A soft footstep on the dry grass behind her did not startle her. She knew that quiet, deliberate tread as well as she knew the rhythm of her own heart. Tasikamna came to stand beside her, his presence a warm, solid reality in the cooling air. In his arms, he held their youngest child, a 2-year-old daughter with his dark, serious eyes and Caroline's fine brown hair. The little girl was sleeping, her head nestled in the crook of her father's uninjured shoulder. He followed her gaze down into the valley, his eyes taking in the same scene. For a long time, they stood in a comfortable silence, a shared quiet that was richer and more intimate than any conversation. It was a silence built from 5 years of shared nights, of worries whispered in the dark, of triumphs celebrated with a simple, knowing glance. They had learned to speak a language that had no need for words. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "Wichaglapi Natsing," he said, using her name, the name that had become the truest definition of her. "Do you ever regret it?" The question was simple, but it held the weight of 1,000 miles, of a life left behind, of a world she had abandoned. Regret. It was a word she had not allowed herself to consider for a very long time. She thought of Philadelphia, of the gray, crowded streets and the suffocating gentility that had almost crushed her. She remembered the life she had been expected to live, a life of quiet desperation in the shadow of a man she did not love. A piece of property passed from one owner to another. It would have been a safe life, perhaps a life with a solid roof and a predictable future. But it would have been a lie, a slow death of the soul. She looked down at the valley again, at the vibrant, difficult, beautiful life she had chosen instead. She thought of the terror of the attack, the gnawing ache of hunger in the canyon, the constant, wearying work of mediating between two suspicious worlds. She thought of the faces of the people they had lost, the ghosts that would forever walk this land with them. There had been so much pain, so much fear. A life of safety, she now knew, was an illusion for anyone, but a life of truth, however hard, had a foundation of stone. She turned her face to him, her eyes clear and certain in the soft, fading light. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have no regrets. It has been the hardest thing I have ever done, but it has been real. Every moment of it has been real." He looked at her, and in his gaze she saw the reflection of her own journey. He, too, had been forced to change, to bend. He was a warrior who had learned the art of politics, a leader who had learned to trust the words on a piece of paper because his wife could read them. They had not saved each other. They had simply chosen to stand together and face the storm. And in doing so, they had found a strength neither of them had possessed alone. He shifted the sleeping child in his arms and leaned forward. He kissed her, a slow, gentle press of his lips against hers. It was not a kiss of fiery passion, but one of deep, abiding partnership. It tasted of wood smoke and autumn and the shared, quiet truth of their life. It was a kiss that acknowledged every scar, every sorrow, and every joy that had brought them to this hill, to this moment. As they drew apart, the sounds of the village seemed to swell, a chorus rising to meet the descending twilight, the laughter of the children, the call of a mother summoning her family to the evening meal, the distant, rhythmic beat of a hand drum where some young men were practicing a song. It was the music of their survival, a symphony of ordinary life. The sun touched the horizon, painting the western sky in brilliant streaks of orange and deep purple. It was beautiful, a moment of breathtaking grace at the end of a long and tiring day. The treaty was not perfect. The peace was not permanent. The world beyond their valley was still full of greed and danger. But here, in this small pocket of the vast and unforgiving West, something new had been planted. It was being nurtured by people who had learned that words have power, that love means responsibility, and that a future worth having must be built by the hands of those who will live in it. The evening wind stirred, whispering through the tall prairie grass. It seemed to carry a name, a story, a promise. Witchaglapi Natsing, the one who stands firm. She stood on the hill beside her husband and their child, a quiet, steadfast sentinel, watching the lights begin to glow in the village below as the first stars pricked the darkness of the enormous sky. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.